Oh, but we got a break. Got a break. I haven't had a break in a long time. It is the keyed foot. Yeah, it's not a good break at all. That's a shame. Dang it.
It's just a bummer.
Yeah, I'm sure Eric can fix it. See what he can do with it.
Eric can fix anything.
He does phenomenal work.
Welcome back to the channel. For anybody that's new here, my name is Eric. I am an artist, and for the last few years I've been specializing in 3D printing. Everything from the printing process to building and assembly and to painting. So now in between 3D printing projects, I've been helping out with the community doing statue repairs, which leads us into today's video. Normally, I do not give out the info whenever somebody sends me a statue for repair. That's all kept private and confidential. But if you watched the beginning of the video, you saw that Chris, the Batman statue collector, was doing a live unboxing of his Batman Damned, and it arrived broken, and he had mentioned that he would be sending me the statue to be fixed. So put two and two together. Obviously, I'm fixing Chris's statue in today's video. So going back to the break, it's the leg that holds the statue into the base. It is so crucial that this gets fixed correctly. If this isn't fixed correctly, the statue is going to come toppling over. So I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to be fixing this 100 times stronger than it ever was before. I'm going to be taking you through the steps of what I did to fix it. So let's start from the beginning. Okay, so here he is, the Prime 1 Studio Batman Damned. This is a 1/3 scale statue, and as you can see, he barely fits on my little workbench here. I'm actually in the middle of upgrading this into something a little bit larger. So yeah, as you can see, Batman's foot broke off, and it's the foot that pegs into the base, which holds up the entire statue. So looking inside the foot with the peg, right away, I can see that it's very hollow inside that area, and taking a look at both halves that broke, right away I could see why this failed. If you look at the middle center core, that's where the peg in the foot ends. The metal rod that runs up the foot to hold them into the base, and the outer rim right there is basically what's held onto the outer rim of the body. It's very thin right there. So when they were manufacturing this, the part that's snapped inside the leg would have been originally attached to the boot. But if you look at that right in the center, that like little nub, it was the only thing that was connecting that boot into that key that went into the leg. Looking inside the cavity of the boot, I could see that the polystone for the most part is all smooth on the inside. It doesn't look cracked in most of the areas. It's just cracked right in the middle, which leads me to believe that this was a casting issue. Possibly maybe air got trapped during the casting process, and this was just bound to fail. The only thing that was holding this together was those two outer rims of the boot area and just that small little center of polystone. So there's no fault of the seller. It was no fault of the shipping service being not careful handling the package. This to me looks like a casting issue, and as mentioned, it was just bound to break with any little pressure, and that's exactly what happened. It must have taken a small little hit and just snapped right off. So with a break like this, what you would want to do is run a metal rod between the two parts. This way it has some structural support when putting the two parts back together. This simply just can't be glued back together. It needs something to hold it up, especially being this is the leg that keys into the base that holds up the entire statue. So as mentioned previously, it's very important that this gets fixed correctly, and this has very solid structural strength on the inside to keep this from falling again and breaking again in the future. So looking at the two broken parts, the plan here is going to be to drill into the body and run a metal rod up into the leg area. I should be able to get up until about the knee, which is about 4 to 5 inches up into the body. and the inside of the boot is already hollow, so I don't need to drill inside of the boot area that much, being it's already hollowed out. What I actually need to do is fill in the boot area and make it more solid, make it more structurally sound. I need to reinforce that outer rim of polystone from cracking and breaking again, because as mentioned, if this isn't fixed correctly, any little break can cause this whole entire thing to come falling down, which I don't want to happen. Taking a look at the boot on the body, there is a small little gap, about maybe 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch around where it broke off. That'll need to be resculpted and reinforced as well. So I'm going to set the rod into the boot and pack it with some epoxy sculpt, and then stand the body up onto the boot and let that settle overnight. And then I can go back the next day and drill into the leg and insert the rod into the leg and glue it all together. This way everything lines up correctly. So as mentioned, I'll be running a rod up into the leg, probably a good 4 inches, and then another 4 inches into the boot. That'll be more than enough to hold these two parts together with some epoxy glue. And so the next step will be drilling into the leg and getting this ready for the metal rod insertion. So let's get to drilling. Okay, so drilling into the leg, I'm currently drilling into the key that was originally attached to the boot, which would have plugged into the leg during the manufacturing process. So it's solid up until maybe where my hand is, a good 2 inches up. So I'm drilling through all solid polystone, and then once it gets up towards the knee, it goes and gets all hollow within the rest of the body. So measuring the rod that I'll be using for the structural support, it looks like I can get a good maybe 5 to 6 inches up into the leg, and then I should be able to get maybe another 2 to 3 inches of the rod into the boot. So here's a look at the hole that was drilled into the leg. Now that I have my measurements for the metal rod, I have to get this cut to size, so it's going to get a little loud, and get ready for some fireworks. Okay, it's the next day, and here's a look at what I did so far. I ran the portion of the metal rod into the boot. I packed about 1 inch or 2 of epoxy sculpt into the boot, just to hold the rod into place as I align it into the body and make sure everything fits correctly. And then I'm going to go back and fully pack in the boot even more to make it more solid, so that 1, that the rod doesn't go anywhere, and 2, to make sure the walls of the polystone up towards the top don't cave in again, because they're very thin, as you can see, towards the top of the boot. So here's a look at the epoxy sculpt holding the rod into place. I did bend the rod a little bit. This way it slides up into his leg and into the knee area, because his knee has a little bit of a slight bend to it. And you can see just with 1 inch of epoxy sculpt, this is already holding up very strong. I can leave it like this and it wouldn't go anywhere, but I'm going to make sure this thing is so reinforced and so strong, it's going to be the strongest thing on the statue. So after this, I'm going to go back in and pack in a little bit more epoxy sculpt. I'm going to add in some high density foam. I don't want to fill this in too solid to make it too heavy. I want to keep the weight and everything kind of what it was coming from the factory. So I'll do a few layers of high density foam, and then on top of that pack in some more epoxy sculpt, and then I'll probably do a layer of epoxy weld, which is an adhesive glue to really reinforce the whole top layer and make the boot nice and solid. So this is a 2-part epoxy sculpt. You just mix up 2 halves and it forms a compound which hardens in about, I would say maybe like 4 to 6 hours, and it'll harden to a rock. Yeah, so basically it's sculpting clay, but it works very well for repairs. So as you can see, I did a layer of foam just to fill in the gaps a little bit, so I don't go through too much epoxy sculpt, and I'm just stuffing it in there right now and really reinforcing that top layer of polystone so it doesn't crack or break, because this needs to be solid. I don't need it breaking and then having the statue fall over. So I'm going to go around packing this in nice and solid, let this dry, and I'll get back to it the next day. Okay, now that the epoxy sculpt is dried within the boot, I created a little cavity around the metal rod, which I'll be inserting some of my epoxy weld to add some extra strength. So I got my 2-part epoxy, and I'm going to mix up a batch of this and insert it into the boot. So I know it sounds a little confusing because I keep saying epoxy sculpt and epoxy weld. The difference between the two is the epoxy sculpt is a clay, and the reason I use that first is I wanted something with a longer curing time and something that I could maneuver the metal rod inside the boot to make sure it had aligned correctly before doing something more permanent with the epoxy weld, which is the glue. Also with the epoxy sculpt, because it is a clay, there's always the chance that maybe I miss a spot and there's an air gap somewhere underneath it and I'm not seeing it, to where the epoxy weld is more free-flowing and more liquid form. So I know it's going to fill every crevice and crack and be more durable and stronger. So that's the reason why I'm using the 2 different products for this repair. Every repair requires different circumstances, and I usually spend a lot of time figuring out the best approach to my actions. So yeah, a lot of thought goes into what I'm doing before I actually do it, and this was the idea that I came up with for this repair. Okay, and here's how it's looking after the epoxy weld, and as you can see, this is all now reinforced. I don't want to have to worry about this caving in and crumbling or crushing. The same thing with the back. I went in and built up the walls of the polystone with some epoxy, and we won't have to worry about this crumbling in the future, because this will be used as my point of access when I attach it back to the leg. I'm going to build all of this back up. So what I'm going to do is, when I go to insert this into the leg and finally glue it into place, I'm going to jam a whole bunch of epoxy sculpt around the first few inches and into the hole. What this will do is, as it gets pushed into the leg, the epoxy glue will move up a little bit and stop at the point where the broken key ends and where it starts to get hollow again. The epoxy weld is kind of like a paste, almost like a lava. It's very slow moving, and it should build up and then expand a little bit towards the top and create like a little puddle on top of the keyhole where it's all solid. So what I'm thinking is it'll create like sort of an anchor that the leg will never slide back down. It'll just grip onto the rod around the threads, create that circular anchor. This way it'll help the leg not be yanked back out in the future. But just around the metal rod itself with all the threading, that's more than enough for this epoxy weld. When it grips onto something, it's very strong, so just around the threads alone and into the hole will be enough to hold this boot into place. And I'm also going to run some along the back here and probably do some epoxy sculpt around the front, because there is a gap and a little bit that I need to go back in and sculpt. So probably going to do a combination of epoxy weld on the back, which is like my glue, and then epoxy sculpt, which is my pre-filler for any gaps. Okay, and we're all set to go. Today is the big day. Today is the day where I'll be gluing the boot back onto his leg, and now I have the base out and ready to make sure that once he's glued together, before it all dries, I want to make sure his feet are sitting correctly on the base and that everything is positioned correctly and looks aligned. So I have the base wrapped in plastic in case there's any drips from the glue. The base is fully protected from any damage. Here's the keyhole, which is the broken leg will be getting inserted into. I also wrapped up the boot to protect it from any spills from the glue. So at this point, I'm just doing a test fit to make sure the boot will fit correctly with all the plastic wrap on it. Here's a look at his body. I also wrapped up his leg to also protect it from any spills. And if you're wondering why his arm is wrapped up, that's actually bubble wrap to make sure I don't accidentally grab that area, because he has his fins on that arm, and those fins or blades are very delicate. So here's a look at the hole that I drilled into his leg that I'll be inserting the epoxy welding glue. And here's a look at our two parts that are ready to be glued and assembled together. So at this point, I'm going to be mixing up a large batch of epoxy weld and stuffing it into the hole on the leg and inserting the metal rod with the boot and getting everything put back together. Okay, so I got the two parts to be attached. I have them on the base. Everything is looking good. This epoxy weld actually cures in 6 minutes, but I'm going to give this an entire day, and I'm going to come back to this tomorrow and everything will be fully cured and ready to handle, and I can begin the sculpting and painting process. Okay, it's the next day, and as mentioned, there was a small gap about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch. So today I'm going to be taking my epoxy sculpt and going around the boot line and filling in that gap, bringing back the sculpt and bringing back the texture and feathering it back into his leg. So this way it all just blends in seamlessly. Then once again, it'll have to cure for a day and I'll come back and start painting. Okay, so I think I did about 4 hours of just going around the boot line and sculpting back the original design. I loosely brought back some of the texture in the pants, but a lot of that will be brought back during the painting process. I went in and I added some folds and creases and just overall brought back the sculpt of his pants back down to the boot line, so everything looks natural and there's no ring around the boot line where the gap originally was. So at this point, the epoxy sculpt is cured and hardened. I'm going to go in and do a little bit of sanding and further feather it into the original sculpt of the pants and try to clean up some of the lines within the sculpt. Okay, so now that I have everything close to about where I want it within the sculpt, I'm going to go in and start priming the area and getting it ready for the paint. I'm using a surface primer. I usually put this on with an airbrush, but because it's such a small area that just wraps around the boot, I'm going to be applying it with a brush. And here's how he's looking so far. Now that the primer is dried, now I can go back in and start working on the paint and matching everything back to the factory colors. And the first thing I'm going to be doing with the paint is mixing up a base tone color of the pants, which is a grayish color. So the first step that I'll be doing is going around and airbrushing the gray base coat over the primer. After that, the pants also have a brown muddy color in certain areas. So after the gray, I'll go in with some brown tones and do some of the weathering. After that, I'll be going back in with a lighter gray color and doing some dry brushing to bring out the highlights. And then the last step will be doing an ink wash to fill in all the cracks and crevices and really make all the details pop. Okay, so now that the pants are done, I did my base coat with the gray. I did my weathering with the brown. I did some dry brushing with the lighter gray to bring out the highlights. I did a layer of clear coat to seal everything in before doing my ink wash to bring out all the details and fill in the cracks with some shading. So one of the last steps to do is to touch up around the boot trim with some black paint. And then I'll be sealing that in with a gloss varnish because within the paint job on the boots, it's actually a mixture of gloss and maybe like a flat or a satin finish. I actually didn't even notice that it had those different finishes on the boot until I started painting it. I guess they're going for maybe trying to make it look wet in some areas, but yeah, there's a gloss finish around the trim of the boot line, as well as certain areas on the creases of the boot. So you have a few different clear finishes. All right, and he's all finished. Let's get him unwrapped and back on the base to see how he looks and take a look at the final result. As always, thanks for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next project.